Oh, well, thank you, and thank you to everybody who organised this. It's wonderful to be here. And I must say, I feel a little bit overwhelmed by all of the first two talks. So they're very good. So thank you for that. All right, now look, my background is in political philosophy, and generally, my concern is with the relationship between ethics and commercialisation, and more specifically, building a framework that's not anti-commercial but acknowledges the moral hazards associated with commercialisation. So what there is here in a lot of this work, and it's not just me, there's a lot of people working in this area, are interested in is how to have a more nuanced approach to the ethics of markets. And I think it's relevant in the debate that we're having here about the commercialisation of big data. All right, some of the readings that are important here, and these are more in the past, 30 years, I suppose. I think traditionally political philosophers tended to be more dismissive of markets or completely in love with them, to put it. And more recently there's been more nuanced approaches, and I think this starts with Michael Walsh's book Spheres of Justice that was published in 1983. I'll say a little bit more about his work later, just in passing, but Walsh talks about, and it was actually this reading Walsh that prompted me to initially to think about ideas about morality in the market. But what he says is there are different spheres of activity where different principles should apply to the activity, and he thinks that in some areas of life shouldn't be governed by the market. But he's a pluralist about which kinds of principles should govern different areas. And following on from that, in 1993, Elizabeth Anderson wrote a book called Value in Ethics and Economics that was highly influential. And similarly, Deborah Satz more recently runs a more radical line about why some things should not be for sale, the moral limits of markets. There has been also a highly popular book by Michael Sandel. His name just escapes me for the moment, but that book probably doesn't have the depth of, without being unkind to Michael Sandel, the book itself doesn't have the sort of depth that these three books have. There's also some stuff that I've done. This is a bit of self-promotion, I suppose, but I've worked in one of the articles, Commercial Medicine, the Ethics of Profit Motive. A lot of that's based also on an early article in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, which was looking at the relationship between morality understood in terms of intrinsic value and the norms that are associated with markets. There's also a book on morality of money, and more recently I did something on the compensation and ethical hazards of commercialising blood plasma. Okay, so look, but what I'm going to try to do here is avoid using philosophical jargon. I'll use examples where possible. And I think some of the practical implications of what I have to say need to be spelled out. My interest, I should say, has been very much in the philosophical puzzle, and what Mark was saying to me yesterday very much was it's not just about the philosophical puzzle, it's about how we implement this in practice. So what I'm hoping to get, and I've already got from listening to both Steve and Natalie today, has been some of the more practical implications and the way that some of these ideas might be implemented. So, and I'm hoping that in the afternoon and through the rest of this day, that's what will come out of it. So, all right. But I do think at the same time, philosophy has a role to play, not just in solving philosophical problems concerning how we set these questions up, but identifying the sources of social concern. I think a part of what I'm about to do connects closely with what Natalie was doing in terms of trying to identify why it is that people might be concerned about the commercialisation of data. So what I shall explore here are not just relevant to sort of philosophical thesis, but general social attitudes. But I do say that some of the social concern is in a sense misplaced. What I want to do is identify what I call morally salient features. So what I'm trying to do is pick out what I take to be the relevant features of commercialisation. And I explain why the concerns are in a sense misplaced and sometimes overstated, though understandably so. And as such, it requires philosophical analysis to solve. But look, I won't go into that much detail. Let's just move on. All right. What's the dilemma here? I explore and set up the dilemma as I see it with regards to the commercialisation of big data. There are dangers associated with it and concerns, but equally there are potential benefits. Do those dangers mean we must adopt a prohibitionist approach? Why or why not? What I mean by a prohibitionist approach is just simply where you say, and this came up in that data where people, the 17% that don't want to have anything to do with the commercialisation of data, health data, they were adopting what I'm calling a prohibitionist approach. All right. So I had a little section here on the sociological background, and I'd read that Ipsos report, and I think, and just to, look, I won't spend any time on this. I thought it was really interesting, but some of the concerns are about big data and some are about medicine being commercialised. I think generally people distrust commercialisation in general, and often for good reason. And there are a range of reasons for concern. Sometimes the concerns that people have about commercialisation of medicine, so I'm just talking about medicine here in the first instance, has to do with injustice, about access to healthcare and so on. It has to do with productive distortion. What I mean by that is where the resource is somehow transformed by by becoming commercialised, so that in some sense the good is not as good as it would be. This is the idea that people have. It was produced publicly. And there's also questions that people have about instrumentality, where people get treated as mere means. All right? So this is something, there's a long tradition in philosophy that goes back to at least Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, where he was concerned about the way in which, well, he was talking about money, but the way in which this leads people to treat anything that's commodified, anything that has money value attached to it, to treat it as a mere means, to treat it as an instrument. So there are those concerns generally, I think, that are lurking in the background of discussions of commercialisation of medicine. And I think there's also mistrust and distrust in relationship to big data. And a lot of this was drawn out by Natalie there, the kinds of things that people are worried about. And I think that distrust often leads to prohibitionist attitudes. I'll say a little bit more about this later, but it has to do with the way it's cast as necessarily involving wrongdoing. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here talking about notions of necessity and the way that this underpins a lot of the discussions of the harmfulness of commercialisation. All right. So what I'm trying to do here is lay out what I think underpins or potentially justifies or a certain kind of prohibitionist approach. All right. What I pick up here are some morally salient features of medical research and medical practice. I think one aspect here has to... Why is it the medical practice? Why do people worry about medical practice in general being commercialised? And I think some of it has to do with the nature of the material being dealt with. What is it we're dealing with? So, I mean, I've got a phrase here, proximity to personhood. You know, there's an old debate about the commercialisation and the sale of human organs. Right? And obviously, you know, your organs are not your person. There's a distinction, well, I don't think they are anyway. But what people worry about, I think, has to do with the proximity to personhood. Right? It's not the same as slavery, but nonetheless, it's a little bit too close for comfort for many people. And so the phrase proximity to personhood is meant to capture something about what many people find troublesome about a lot of commercialisation surrounding various kind of medical practices. People also worry about personal information. There are fears of anxiety associated with that. And there's also a concern of, obviously, you know, medicine itself is involved in certain kind of scientific progress, and there's concern that somehow that's going to be undermined. There's also values associated with medicine, and I felt that these are at odds with commerce, and commercial medicine violates them. Look, I think, again, Natalie, before you spoke of these, there's a notion that there are certain kinds of values that are appropriately associated with medicine, such as care, for instance. And at the moment, the commercial relationship comes in. So when you talk about the context collapse, what you're doing is it's a sort of intrusion of commercial values into another realm of values where they're inappropriate. Now, Elizabeth Anderson in particular spends a lot of time talking about this. So in her book, Values in Ethics and Economics, she says she's a pluralist about values. There's different values appropriate to different spheres. So in this, she follows on from Michael Walser. And she thinks that some areas, and medicine is an obvious area like this, or at least some people see it as such, is an area where the intrusion, the incursion of sort of commercial values is seen to be inappropriate. Somehow it's meant to kind of violate the appropriate sort of caring relationship that's involved in medicine. Look, and this is not something I'm necessarily endorsing here, but I think it's meant to partly explain why there are concerns about commercialisation of medicine generally. All right, there are also what I call data dangers, and I think there are specific normative concerns that people have about commercialisation of data. And these come up before, and I don't pretend that this is an exhaustive list. So there are concerns about the violation of confidentiality, and all of those discussions that were had about anonymised, de-identified and so on reflect the fear that people have that their confidentiality is going to be violated, particularly when the data is being commercialised. There are questions of injustice with respect to insurance. I mean, I hadn't seen that little bit on the graph. I mean, it was sort of funny that it was even off, the insurers weren't even on the graph, so... but I mean, I think that's a general concern that people have, and it's very, very common. Even people that haven't reflected much on commercialisation of medicine, such people are often willing to kind of say, well, I don't think that insurers should have hold of that information. There's manipulation of people through manipulation and understanding of the data. And there's another case here, which, I mean, it was interesting that came up in Steve's talk, the hampering the growth of science through overly restrictive, well, just generally, let's not worry about overly restrictive confidentiality clauses, but there's a concern with hampering the growth of science, that by commercialising data, that we might well, in some sense, hamper the growth of science. And again, these are all legitimate concerns, and I think they reflect, to say they're legitimate doesn't necessarily mean that they provide grounds for prohibition. But I think that these... now, one of the things you might question is whether the sort of way that I've teased these out is what's actually going on in people's thinking. But I think there's good reason for thinking it is the case. Sorry. All right. Now, there are countervailing benefits, though, for commercialisation. So on the one hand, this is what I'm trying to do is set up a dilemma here. There are countervailing benefits. In many instances, commercial firms can make use of data to provide useful products for patients as consumers, for instance. All right. There's absorbing the costs of research and providing benefits. All right? So one of the things is, and I think Mark talked about this earlier, and I don't know what the situation is here, but certainly in Australia, where I come from, there's a limited health budget, and researchers are often struggling to get hold of the funds that are required, and often they look towards industry. So one of the benefits of commercialisation is it does absorb some of the costs of research, and it can potentially provide benefits. And as it says, the research structure as it stands, at least in countries, and I think it's the same here, but certainly in Australia where I come from, I think it's true right across the Western world, can't function on public funding alone. And I think this is not so much a countervailing benefit, but it's a countervailing factor. I mean, data is less proximate in a sense. I mean, it's not, as I say, that the question of proximity to personhood, I don't think it's quite as significant in this case. It's not like selling human organs, and hence those kinds of concerns are less compelling. I'm not saying that there is, I mean, look, of course, people say, as you said before, Natalie, it's my data. So obviously I think it's mine, and so there's that aspect to it. But when you're talking about a lot of aggregated data, presumably they don't have the same sense of ownership. And I think partly, but I do think a lot of this data that we're talking about isn't going to give rise to the same sorts of concerns about proximity to personhood. And that was important, I think. All right, so what I want to do is step back a little bit from some of these concerns to articulate two claims or theses that I believe are lurking behind the prohibitionist criticisms of the commercialisation of medicine and big data. So what I want to do is step back and do a little bit of philosophy for a while and think about the two claims I think that are there. I don't say it here, but I think both of them are what I want to call disjunctive claims. Namely, there's a disjunction between morality and commerce. They're, in the sense, they're mutually exclusive. If you have commerce, then you don't have morality. And if you have morality, you don't have commerce. I remember reading, there's a quote of William Blake's. He says, where there's money, there's no art, and where there's art, there's no money. All right, it's that kind of idea. Similarly, when we tease these two theses out, or claims, in the way that I do, I suggest it becomes clear that they're overstated. I don't think they're necessarily the only thesis, but I think they're two important theses, and I think they're part of a more general tendency to want to treat morality and commerce as mutually exclusive. I also suggest too, and I think this is kind of interesting, the ways to make them plausible are at the same time open up the space for a more moderate non-prohibitionist approach to the public policy issue. So what I'm trying to say here is I think there are genuine reasons for concern with commercialisation, but those reasons don't necessarily give rise to grounds for prohibition. Right? That's the argument, right? And I'm trying to avoid, it's a more moderate middle way if you like, but I'm trying to avoid the idea that the two are necessarily at odds with one another. And you can have a critical view and a critical perspective on commercialisation and commercialisation of medicine and commercialisation of big data, and yet it still can allow, at least in some instances, for you to go ahead with commercialisation. All right, so here are these two claims, and I hope I'm not being too obscure here. Commercialisation necessarily, the evacuation thesis. This is and I'm suggesting that these are overstated. All right? So the evacuation thesis is that commercialisation necessarily involves or generates instrumental modes of regard, where those things commodified or treated as mere objects. All right? Famously, I talked before about Immanuel Kant. Kant said everything, he has a price dignity dictum in his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and there he talks about how price and dignity or respect are mutually exclusive. And he says if it has a price, then it doesn't have a dignity. If it has a dignity, it doesn't have a price. And the idea that I think, and Kant's been very influential, so if you read a lot of report discussions of, I'm not talking about big data here, but particularly the selling of organs, you'll find a common strategy for those who are opposed to it is to invoke Kant and to invoke something like this. The moment that you commercialise something, the moment you put a price on something, then you eradicate, evacuate, eliminate the value or dignity that's associated with it. And I think there are cases where this is true, as I'll say, but I think it's overstated. And a lot of why I think it's overstated has to do with the word necessarily. All right, the second point here has to do with the what I call the avarice-only conception of the profit motive. Now, look, one important point to make here is that if we commercialise, then we rely on the profit motive as an incentive, as part of our incentive system. Right? And often this is the benefit that supposedly, the benefits arise because we do. The profit motive comes to the fore. Right? It's one of the reasons that people want to commercialise is because they think that the profit motive will incentivise productive activity and therefore give rise to more benefits to society as a whole. But many critics expressed concerns about the profit motive itself. And the concern is expressed, as I'll express it in that phrase there, concerns the relationship between the profit motive and other regarding concerns. Now, what I mean by other regarding concerns here, this just goes back to self-regarding actions and other regarding actions. If you take John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, he spoke about that I can do whatever I like, whatever harms I like in relationship to self-regarding actions, things that only affect me, but there's a limit on what kinds of activities I can engage in if they affect others. And the avarice-only conception of the profit motive, I think, sets it up such that the profit motive necessarily excludes other regarding concerns. So that if I'm engaged, once I get in the grip of the profit motive, then the moment I do so, then my concern for other people will disappear. All right? And again, I think this is overstated, but you see it in some of the novels of, say, Dickens, for instance. There's a concern that the moment that the people that are searching profit are only concerned about seeking profit. Right. Now, and we can talk about this a little bit later, if you like. Notice that both of these theses or claims provide, in a sense, provide grounds for prohibition. If the thing is something that's intrinsically valuable or it's a socially important good, which many people see medicine as being, then it seems like this provides grounds for not allowing it to be commercialised at all. Now, you might think the sale of, you could hold these theses and think that the sale of beans could be, is fine because they're not intrinsically valuable, don't involve other regarding concerns necessarily. But you would allow commerce in that kind of area, and this is sort of spheres approach that someone like Elizabeth Anderson or Michael Walzer. But there are, in the important spheres of human life, like medicine, you're going to want to say that there shouldn't be any commercialisation. But as I say, both of these provide strong grounds, if they're correct, for prohibition of the commercialisation of at least some goods. And if we talk about if they apply them to data, they would provide grounds for that. But I think one of the things about this is that there are counterexamples, and which, once you think about them, seem fairly obvious. Just take the evacuation thesis, all right? And I've got the word compossibility. I mean, there are cases where, regarding something intrinsically valuable as being intrinsically valuable, and gaining profit from it, having a price on it, coexist. They're compossible. They're compatible. And I think about the jobs that many of us have, for instance. And I think about the job that I do. I certainly regard it as intrinsically valuable. Right? I enjoy the work that I do. I think it's valuable, and I think a lot of the people here in this room would also see their work as intrinsically valuable. But at the same time, I get paid for it. I get money for it. And the mere presence of money doesn't necessarily evacuate the intrinsic value that I hold for it. Interestingly, I've got this thing about work versus labour. Hannah Arendt, in a discussion of work, distinguishes work and labour, and she says work is what I'm saying is work that is activity that you can be paid for, in which you believe in, and which you regard as intrinsically valuable. Whereas labour is this, what you do because you have to, whether you have to do it, just say for money, or for whatever reason you work. So I think so many of us engage in work which we do not regard instrumentally. We don't regard it simply as a means of making money. Yet we do make money. And as I say, they are, in the philosopher's phrase, compatible. I think that's a fairly obvious case. So when you think about it, you think, well, hang on. No, there are some things that are intrinsically valuable. I get paid for it, but it doesn't undermine the fact that I regard it as intrinsically valuable. All right? And despite, people for years mouthed Kant's dictum that everything has a price, has a dignity. It doesn't have a dignity. If it has a dignity, it doesn't have a price, and so on. All right? And yet, many of us have the experience of engaging in something for money that we still regard as valuable. And I think part of this has to do with the possibility of mixed motives. Our motives are much more complicated than some of these theses suggest. The second one, we go back a little bit, that was about the profit motive, and I call it the avarice-only conception of profit motive. And that's this, once you're kind of engaged in seeking profit, then other regarding concerns for other people disappear, and you become rather like Mr. Gradgrind. But counter that, sometimes one can have profit motives which include other regarding concerns. Right? So one can make a profit in order to help others. So one of your goals is to make the profit for someone else's good. You can think of lots of cases where that's true, where one makes a profit and the aim is to make a profit, but you have mixed motive. You might have two goals. Part of my goal is to do, to make money in this enterprise, but also I have other goals in it. All right? So it's not as if the problem, in a way, is talking about the profit motive as singular motive. Now, I talked about it, the profit motive there, but I think there's a range of profit motives, or a variety of profit motives. I think it's an unfortunate way that we talk about it, to talk about the profit motive as a singular motive. Now, the second one here is another way in which this is counterexample, is that profit-seeking activity sometimes includes side constraints on what you might do in relationship to other people, right? So my goal is profit-seeking, right? I want to make as much money as possible. I don't have any other goals. But nonetheless, there's certain things that I won't do in the pursuit of that profit, right? And you can think what it might be. Engage in production of some, socially pernicious, videos or whatever it is. Think of something you take to be morally reprehensible. You might say, there's many things I would do for money, but I wouldn't do that. Right? So that differs from the first case, because it's not that you have a couple of goals, and it's not like you've got mixed motives. You've got a goal to make money, but there are side constraints on that. And I think it's this latter one that's really important in thinking about the commercialisation of data, because this is the profit motivational set, if you want to call it that, or the variety of the profit motive, which involves side constraints of the kind, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, but it connects up with what Natalie was saying before about the kinds of things we think you shouldn't do in relationship to commercialisation of data. All right. So again, so I just want to point that the second one I think is what's really important here, that you can have a goal of pursuing profit, but there's a whole lot of things you wouldn't do. And so so what I'm trying to attack is this sort of disjunctive view that it's either commerce or morality. Right? And that you can have, the idea is here, you have seeking profit as a goal, but not necessarily, there's a whole range of things you think that are side constraints and moral side constraints on your activity. So anyway, it looks like the profit motive is a bit more complicated than people tend to acknowledge. And as I suggest here, I don't think that it is a single motive. I don't think there's a single motive, called the profit motive. I think there's a range of different profit motives. Right, so what I want to do now is just in the next little bit reformulate those objections, because I do think there's something to them. Okay, this is not some knockdown attempt to show that people are really stupid, that there's nothing to these concerns, that, when the philosophers come to look at this, they show that people's ordinary beliefs are mistaken. It's not that kind of enterprise. What I'm trying to do here is just reformulate these in what I take to be a more plausible way. Right? So the first one is what I call the corrosion thesis, and this is meant to be reformulation of what I call the evacuation thesis. So I take these things about a relationship to intrinsic value and intrinsic attitudes to intrinsically valuable things. I think if one incorporates something with intrinsic value in the exchange relations of the marketplace, then there'll be a strong tendency for that intrinsic value to slip from the picture. It's a rather colloquial way of putting it, but you get the general idea. The picture here is causal rather than necessary. It's not like there's a necessity that the moment you commodify something, the moment you commercialise it, that you will turn it into something that you just value as a mere means to making profit. The point here is that there's a strong tendency for that. It's a causal relationship, right? That once you commercialise things, there can be a tendency for intrinsic value to slip from the picture. And I think, according to this thesis, calculating the cash value of an object corrodes one's capacity to value goods intrinsically. It corrodes it rather than evacuates it. So the corrosion thesis simultaneously makes sense of our apprehension of incorporating into the commercial realm objects, activities and relationships we regard as intrinsically valuable, while accounting for the various readily available counterexamples, such as the case of work, to the claim that money or price evacuates value. Now, one thing you might do, look, I gave this problem of work before, and you might think, oh, that just shows, it's nonsense that, okay, look, there you are, you've got work, and work rather than labour, and there you've got something where you get money for it, and yet you still value it intrinsically. And you might sort of therefore be sceptical about the connection between money and commercialisation and the loss of intrinsic value. That's not the path I want to go down. The path I want to go down here is to say, look, there is a concern there, but the problem is it's just overstated. Like, we need to be careful that we don't overstate the claim. All right. So that's the first concern. Now the second one, this is a bit of whimsy on my part, so forgive me for indulging myself, I suppose. I had this term, Luca Pathak, and I used it in lots of papers, and eventually it got in word a day, so I thought that was a win. That was part of my aim. But anyway, it comes from the idea of lucas and money and pathology. So someone's a Lucapath when they'll do anything for money. It actually came out of a debate that I was involved in at the time about mercenaries, because people talk about mercenary motives, all right? And that someone has mercenary motives if someone will do anything for money. But if you look historically, it turns out that lots of the mercenaries were quite morally motivated. The whole things they wouldn't do. I mean, I'm talking about in the 13th, 14th century. Right? So they had a list of activities that they wouldn't engage in. His name's forgotten me. There was a famous English mercer in the 13th, 14th century that somebody might be able to tell me, who had quite a remarkable list of things that he wouldn't do while fighting. So it partly came out of that, but anyway, in debates about mercenaries, some people now talk about Lucapaths. And the profit motive is a moral concern when it's Lucapathic. That is when agents are only concerned about the pursuit of money and either have no moral side constraints, no moral goals and no moral side constraints. In short, we're concerned with cases where there's nothing that a person would not do in order to make money. So the kind of profit motive that I'm worried about here is where somebody is just, it is the grey grind thing, or what people used to say, the way that people characterise mercenaries. They'll do anything for money. There are no moral side constraints on their activity. And I think the useful thing to do here is to think about there's actually a variety of profit motives. And I've got 3 here. And look, and this is not meant to be exhaustive again. So in Luca Pathak action, seeking profit is the sole or dominant consideration and agents all things considered judgments. In a cumulative action, while the profit motive is the primary goal of action, its pursuit is moderated either by moral goals that have weight or by moral side constraints. In a stipendiary action, the profit motive is not a goal, but rather functions as a side constraint on action directed by other non-commercial goals. All right, so the idea is you've got a variety of profit motives, and the one that's really a problem is where people will do anything for money, all right, which is the Luca path. And so the point of this is, okay, why am I going into this sort of discussion of a taxonomy of different kinds of profit motives? It's because I think the importance of when we're looking at commercialisation of big data, that it's not as if there's a single motive that those who are who are involved commercially will necessarily have. And the motives that we need to worry about are those that involve have no moral side constraints. And the sorts of things, I'll say a little bit more about this before, but I mean, what Natalie was talking about before, the sorts of side constraints that people might have to do with concerns about confidentiality clauses or constraints on the proliferation of monopolies or whatever, kinds of things where people don't worry about the consequences of what they're doing, or they're not worried about on-selling information that might identify people and so on. All right, so in that case, there are a relevant set of, this is an abstract here, or in general, but there are a set of moral side constraints that are relevant to the selling of commercialisation of data. All right, the other point here is, it's sort of awkwardly phrased, but we also want to characterise these as moral hazards. The kinds of way that I'm setting that up is in terms of what I'm calling a moral hazard. And the idea here is that the relationship between the moral phenomena of commercialisation and the sort of what you would take to be a morally bad outcome isn't a relationship of necessity. It's not necessarily the case, that was part of the point I was making before, it's not necessarily the case that if you commodify or commercialise something that it will have bad consequences. If you take the Kant line, what he's talking about there when he says everything has a price or a dignity, if it has a price, it doesn't have a dignity. And he means that necessarily. All right? But what I'm trying to push here is the idea that there are moral hazards associated with commercialisation. These moral hazards are such that if they, there's danger of these bad outcomes, and you need to be careful of those. All right? And that's why there are genuine grounds for concern, but at the same time, it's not as if commercialising necessarily will give rise to bad outcomes. All right, so as I say, the term moral hazard is used here, refers to temptations for morally vicious behaviour. But given our natural proclivities, certain processes, institutional frameworks or states of affairs might present to us. The term actually has it's got a number of different meanings in economic theory. One of them, as some of you would know, has to do with if you have, it's related to the tragedy of the commons that you were talking about before, where if you don't provide people with an incentive to, if it's publicly owned, then there's an incentive for people not to treat it well, right? And that's regarded by many economists as a moral hazard. That's only one usage of the term. There's a number of them. I've using it here to mean something like that there's a danger in these circumstances, given our natural proclivities and so on, for us to engage in morally vicious behaviour. And one result of revising our objections in these ways is that commercial medicine, and more specifically the profit motive that is part and parcel of commercial medicine, instead of being necessarily a moral institution, can now be said to provide us with what we might call a moral hazard. So I think there are dangers. The point of this is not to kind of poo-poo, to somehow be sceptical about the idea that commercialisation brings with it dangers, but nonetheless they're not dangers of necessity. And that is the way that people have set it up. They've got this disjunction between morality and commerce, and what comes with that is a view that that the badness, the wrongness, the wrongdoing comes necessarily. All right, so opening up a space but operationalising. Okay, what I've done here is, in a sense, opened up a space for potential or possible commercialisation, because what I'm saying is that it's not necessarily the case that it gives rise to bad outcomes. All right. And my conclusion is, if we are to commercialise, and there will often be good reasons for doing so, sorry, I've had to last a little bit out there, then we require, now you have to listen rather than kind of watch that up there, okay? Then we require moral constraints within commercial activity, all right? So what we require are moral constraints within commercial activity. So the point is that that commercial activity can go ahead, but there needs to be moral constraints within it. Part of this is driven by, it was inspired by some writing of R.H. Tawney, who in 1926 wrote a book called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And in that he talks about economic casuistry. And what he means is, within commercial practice, within the marketplace, people draw distinctions between morally legitimate and morally illegitimate market activities. Right? And that was kind of part of the inspiration here. Anyway, it stands against both the radical tradition and the spheres approach of Walser and Anderson, because these are both disjunctive. The radical tradition I have here is something like the socialist tradition, if you want to put it that way, which rejects commerce as morally pernicious, at least in medicine. And I think this has been influential to some extent on the idea of public provision of medical services. As I say, it's underpinned by the disjunctive views of a necessary divide between commerce and morality. The spheres approach, I mentioned there, of Anderson and Walser, what they say is, look, commerce is a morality-free zone. Right? It's a morally free zone. When you engage in commerce, you're not engaged in anything that's got anything to do with morality. So we only want to have some spheres allowed to be commercial, some spheres of life to be commercialised. Right? And I think what's interesting there is that, so what they think is, there's a whole bit of areas we don't want to commercialise, but those that we do, it's just morally free zone, anything goes in there pretty much within, and we'll set up laws, but there's no moral concerns. I'm running a slightly different line, obviously. As I say, I'll just leave that. It opens up a space for morality within commercial activity. Thus far, however, this is only a philosophical conclusion. It opens, as I keep using this phrase, it opens a space for the possibility of this kind of reasonable commercialisation. But demonstrating the possibility is not enough for policy or practical responses. So the question then becomes how we operationalise that. All right? How do we ensure that there is morality within commercial activity in terms of big data? How do we avoid the moral hazards? How do we distinguish between practices that are legitimate and those that are illegitimate? How do we avoid corrosion? Those are the real questions. And as I say, I have got a few suggestions, and I'm sort of interested in what people have to say, but I think what we require are the kinds of side constraints which were noted in both the talks about the concerns about what happens when commerce goes wrong. So both the talks we've had so far, where you might have, for instance, limits on confidentiality clauses. You might have constraints on what is done with data. And these all seem quite reasonable constraints, I think. And they could be both parts of codes of ethics, but also legislated for. So the idea here is that if we have commercialisation, and if there are reasons for commercialising, and if there are times when there are good grounds for doing so, we need to make sure that there are the appropriate sorts of moral side constraints. Now, teasing out what those moral side constraints are is obviously there's more work, but you get the general idea of the picture. So look, I might leave it there and open up for if anybody's got questions they want to ask. Okay, thank you.